Hello everybody and welcome. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to write music in the style of Over the Garden Wall. And let's get started with an example of what we're going over. Over the Garden Wall is one of the finest soundtracks ever put to television, in large part because the music transports us into the world of the unknown. But how did they do that, and how can we write our own music in that style? Let's get started by talking about our Storybook Foundation. Over the Garden Wall is meant to evoke classical music and early Americana music. To help give the feeling of those time periods, we need to use elements of that music. We'll be using the main theme Into the Unknown as inspiration, and specifically the first section. I broke down Into the Unknown into 4 sections, each 4 measures long, for a total of 16 measures. Longer progressions, meaning ones that are over 8 measures, lend themselves to storybook style music because it gives the impression that the music is going on a journey. Another element to the storybook feel is the 3/4 time signature. This time signature was common in early American and classical music. Next, the use of chord inversions. And inversions let you expand seemingly simple chords to something that sounds much more complex. Our chord progression will be in the key of D minor. If you're wondering, the original song Into the Unknown is in the key of C sharp minor. The foundation of the progression is based around these 3 chords: the 1 chord, D minor, the 4 chord, G minor, and the 5 chord, A dominant 7. In addition, we'll use some specialty chords to help extend the progression. These will include those chord inversions, the cadential 6/4, a secondary leading tone chord, and the Neapolitan chord. First, listening to the foundation chords, the 1, 4, 5. We're breaking the progression down into 4 parts, and part 1 is super easy. It's a 1 to 4 sequence that has some chord inversions. Part 1 goes like this: the tonic chord D minor, then the tonic chord over the 7th scale degree, D minor over C, then the 4 chord in first inversion, G minor over B flat, and the 4 chord in root position, G minor. The descending bass line of D, C, and B flat in those first 3 chords gives movement to the music. Here's what this first part sounds like. With chord inversions, you see how we can take 2 simple chords and extend them to create movement and variety in our music. But that's only the first part, because for the next section, we're going to use a very classical turnaround. And a turnaround is when you use a collection of chords that build momentum back to the tonic 1 chord. The one we're going over, like I said, was a very, very common turnaround in classical music, much like the chord inversions we were just using. This turnaround goes D minor over A, which is called a cadential 6/4. And a cadential 6/4 is a tonic chord over the dominant scale degree, so D minor over A are dominant. And this chord is nearly always followed by the dominant chord, which is A dominant 7. Then we'll do a simple tonic dominant sequence. Here's our first 2 parts, which completes the first 8 measures of our progression. If you wanted, you could easily loop those 8 measures to get something pretty close to Into the Unknown. But if you want to get as close as you can to the music, we've got to go deeper into some music theory. Section 3 starts with the exact same 2 chords that started off the first one. But the next chord we're using, it's what's called a secondary leading tone chord. This chord is a fully diminished chord 1/2 step below the dominant chord we're going to. In our case, a G sharp fully diminished chord. It wants to resolve directly to A dominant 7. So, part 3 of the progression goes D minor over C, G sharp fully diminished over B, so a secondary leading tone in an inversion, and then A dominant 7. We now have a similar descending bass line that we used in part 1. Here's what that sounds like. We are now in the home stretch, and to finish it off, we're going to use one of my favorite chords in classical music, the Neapolitan chord. For part 4, we're going to the 6th chord, B flat. Then we've got the cadential 6-4 again. And remember when I said that the chord nearly always resolves to the dominant? Well, you can also have it resolve to a Neapolitan chord. I've got a video on the Neapolitan chord if you'd like to know a little bit more about it and where it comes from. The Neapolitan then resolves to the dominant. Here's what our last section sounds like combined with the other 3 parts to give us our final progression. We've got our completed progression, and this is the part where your creativity comes into play, because now it's up to you to think of a melody that goes along with our progression. If you want something close to Into the Unknown, let's go over some final few tips. To get a piano style like Into the Unknown, use single notes in the bass clef, often jumping large intervals like octaves. Next, play the chord in the treble clef on the downbeat of the measures. So when you start a measure, play the chord. For the melody, write simple ones using half, quarter, and eighth notes. We don't want to play anything too fast since that would ruin the feel we're going for, so no 16th notes. And finally, sprinkle in some chord arpeggios. An arpeggio is when you play each note of the chord separately rather than all at once. Here is the final composition using the progression we went over, along with these tips to mimic the Over the Garden Wall style. If you're familiar with Into the Unknown, you would know that this is actually only the first half of the song that we went over. If you liked this type of analysis, let me know in the comments if you want to see the second half of the song. Anyway, that's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.